Hello, this is Vision Denial and Clearing Vision MSI 2022. My name is Sam, and for those who are new to the channel, I've watched every single playoff game of every region for all the participating regions. Yes, including that one. The Rumble stages have come and gone. We say goodbye to our last team, and hello to the four who move on. I was not trying to get this to rhyme, and we've only got so much time. I don't know what I'm doing with this. Just to get a couple of things out of the way. So, there have been no tiebreakers, so it was a very clean day. The pieces fell as they were. Not to say that there wasn't any upsets is not the word I would go for, but not that there weren't any surprises, or at least some surprises regarding the situation. And overall, I think a lot of people could be happy about the turnouts of the tournament. This has been so far one of the better MSIs, All-Stars, this genre of the Riot-sanctioned tournaments in quite some time. Last year had some very exciting finals regarding the situation, but most of the rest of the tournament was lax, a little all over the place. This year, quality of the games is pretty good. So let's actually take a look at these games in just overall. Let's start with the first game of the day. We got the LEC's G2 Esports versus the VCS's Saigon Buffalos. And remember, Saigon Buffalos have already been eliminated, so they only play spoilers, and they came in swinging. And they said we're maybe the second seed of the VCS, but we're still terrifying. The early game tempo from Saigon Buffalos is something to behold, as they do not let go at any point with the constant aggression, understanding that if they ever fell behind with the kind of draft that they set up for themselves, it would be very difficult to navigate. They also understand the awkward approach that G2's draft lent itself, and force them to create mistakes out of them, using a lot of the vision denial so excellently put forward by them. The Buffalo's vision control could use some work, but they found a workaround that what usually would be G2's excellent vision play that wasn't really there for them on their part, specifically speaking of. They continue to look kind of disjointed, as if it becomes super unclear where the mid-jungle duo dynamic went. The draft choices are excellent, even if a little awkward, playing to the top side of the map. But for 5 games in a row now, something has been called out, and if G2 want a chance at breaking even, maybe, going back to standard comfort of play, possibly, with just a teensy bit draft that's a little less awkward to navigate. That probably could help with some of the context. Let's take a look at the gold graph, just to give a context here. All right. So taking a look at the gold graph here, this isn't one of those situations where the Buffaloes were sort of holding back in the early game. No, this was a clear understanding from start to finish of how the G2's draft worked and took control early, not letting go. Right? The first couple of 10 minutes is fairly close across the board, but 10-minute mark hits, and it's just continuous aggression nonstop. There is something to be said about the fact that the Buffaloes aren't ballooning the lead as crazy as they should, but the tempo in which they play doesn't ever let up, and in fact increases over time, making it absolutely difficult for G2 to play. And it's games like this that honestly make me wonder, how much is G2's confidence about standard play and being good at the standard play, or about sowing chaos? And if they are not able to control the chaos that is being sown, how far behind do they get? Let's head off to the next game. We got North America's LCS's Evil Geniuses versus the PCS's Paris Saint-Germain Talons. Evil Geniuses have shown tremendous amounts of improvement across the board. To note, the Talons had some very solid opening to this game, holding pressure in the right spots to get their win conditions going and nullifying some of the Geniuses' setup. However, the overzealous approach to neutrals and lack of vision control failed them as they played into a Nocturne composition through Fog of War. Had the setup for team fighting scenarios that they had the setup for team fight scenarios that forced Evil Geniuses to walk into them, it would be one thing if they did have that setup. But the Geniuses had so much information on them that they could use Paranoia consistently, slowly picking off members of the Talons one by one. And I do not want to preface this as if it's just a game that the Geniuses had just gotten a win from punishing mistakes. No. Throughout the game, it kind of might have gone unnoticed. They did something I hadn't seen them pull off before, which is excellent to see as they go into the semifinals. The wording I want to go with is that they were ballooning leads off of laning phase and passive play. They were choking out their opponents in situations where it would force the Talons to make mistakes, right? When you're in a situation where you're just consistently bleeding resources, not from being killed so often, but because you're forced off of any of them, it forces you to make mistakes. And the Geniuses proactively set themselves up in areas of attack where they knew they could get these advantages from the forced mistakes. All it took was one last Baron, and as the team with the most efficient Baron play still, they get the win, securing them and also T1 top 4 spots. Now the Talons, for their part, have a chance for their last spot, but they will really need to win their last game and hope that G2 lose theirs. And facing off against the Royals is not so dicey. Let's take a look at the goal graph real quick. Right? And it's not to be stated here, but this is a fairly back and forth situation in terms of the early game, but not because of anything that it's super unclear from the situation. But you see this here, the 17-minute mark, this huge ballooning happening here is not from consistent nonstop kills. This is from the Geniuses really choking out their opponents at any given moment. They never, as an opportunity, do they ever get a chance to approach a neutral ever again, or any opportunity to get any kind of resource. And honestly, fantastic to see as they head to the semifinals. Let's take a look at the next game. We've got the Saigon Buffalos of the VCS in their last game of the tournament versus the LCK's T1. T1 are showing more and more comfort and return to form. The occasional fumbles, notably when leaving Gumayusi to just take a turret topside and they go fight 4v5. Yeah, it happens. Otherwise, this was clean, calculated, and textbook early game T1. Vision is immaculate, and this time they don't attempt to play around the Baron for a potential endgame fight, opting to just take it once they've cleaned house. If this continues to be the trend we see out of them, then perfect. They will likely go into the semifinals in full force and a scary team at that. The Buffalos, for their part, really did as much as they could to limit the win conditions of T1, recognizing where the potential problem areas could be. But by the time they realized the issue was happening bot lane with Gumayusi, it was too late to address, and the rest of T1 could just coordinate defense and a solid team fight wins on top of the oppressive siege. And that just lands them the victory for T1. And let's take a look at the goal graph here. All right? I say this was classic T1 fashion. I do mean that. This game ends before 24 minutes, standard for a classic T1. They grab first blood, all resources, and the ballooning of the lead is just nonstop. And the Buffalos, for their part, try as they might. They do get kills. They do find opportunities to regain some pressure. But, like, it's not enough from the way that there's, like, such a heavy siege that T1 gets. It's kind of nice to see that T1 is starting to come back on form. And if it wasn't for the fact that we saw the Buffalos go, like, as crazy as they did, people would have been like, oh, it's an easy game. But we saw how the Buffalos have been playing. And honestly, great across the board to see the T1 keep up this effort. Let's take a look at the next game. We've got the PCS's Paris Saint-Germain Talons versus the LPL's Royal Never Give Up. And this is the last game we see out of the Talons. It's like too little too late, you know? The Talons had shown some incredible performances, notably against G2. But as far as anything goes, this game was a perfect hallmark for some of their weaknesses. Disjointed play, slow to start in the early game, rough and inconsistent vision approach, rushed neutrals, and overall a lot of passivity that just leads to a rough time for them. It often feels like we have a top, middle, jungle, and then bot duo, all separate and not as a cohesive team. Just no melding or coordination, which is super unfortunate because this isn't the regular season performance that we are so used to seeing from them. The Royals, for their part, don't do much in the early game to shake things up or shake up how we see them necessarily in terms of their early game, but they really do ramp up their strengths for the mid and late game plays. There's just their bread and butter. Still a little slow for how they want to approach anything, opting to end the game after 2 separate resets where they could have ended those games at any of those opportunities. Those are situations that stronger teams would usually abuse. But otherwise, this is the cleanest team MSI has shown us so far. Let's take a look at the goal graph real quick. And, like, slow and steady, and the curve itself only starts leaning more further into the mid-game point. Otherwise, it's kind of flattened. It's not anywhere huge, and we don't crest that notable mark until then. But otherwise, unfortunately, because of the Talons' passivity and being unable to really contest anything, almost all of the major notable resources and neutrals go the way to the Royals. And as any sending off kind of game, this is super unfortunate from them. They go only one game off of being last place. And honestly, they could have ended up being last place, which is unfortunate for a team that straight up could have been the reason G2 got eliminated. But thanks to this, G2 get to qualify for the next game, or for the next round, which is not great on how G2 want to go into the semifinals. Let's go to the next game, actually. Let's discuss that. We've got the LCS's Evil Geniuses versus the LEC's Gamers 2 G2 Esports. Gamers 2 is their old name. This was a fairly important game for G2. Not for standings or placements in the semifinals, but to show that their string of losses isn't an indicator of a steady decline. Mostly because, again, they qualified for the semifinals purely based off of the fact that the Talons lost. Otherwise, they could have been in a precarious set of circumstances. This game started off pretty rough also, as the decisions to lane swap was rather questionable under my, as far as I can tell. The pedigree of that Impact has should have been enough to know that it was not a good idea to roll swap caps to the top lane, as it caused a significant gold issue. That said, it helped get Broken Blade over the significant hump he would have had if he had to deal with Impact, and Evil Geniuses did nothing to answer the situation that was going on with Flackid, whose personal gold lead alone was able to shrink the entirety of the setup that the Geniuses had set up. They had a 2K lead that just gone. just gone from Flackett alone. And by the time that the mid-game rolled around, like, come on. The Geniuses had some solid setups, getting soul point even, but some overcommitted plays, getting caught frequently, and not having enough answers for the Flackett situation made every subsequent fight harder and harder to navigate. The Geniuses are still showing that a huge amount of growth from them, but G2 still have their number, and the Geniuses really need to rethink how they prioritize and answer leads from their opponent, especially since they're going to be facing the Royals in the semifinals. Let's take a look at the gold graph real quick. So, just taking a look at the situation, immediately you can tell the Geniuses had a 2K lead, just a 2K lead, and by the time we're getting to the mid-game mark, a lot of that lead starts to shrink, ebb and flow, and part of it has to do with how they were not answering how Flackett is growing. And by the time that it's equalized, rendering ourselves into the late game, the Geniuses are just continuously overcommitting on plays that G2 just seem to understand how to navigate. G2, and I forgot to mention this in my thoughts and notes, have a solid idea of how to navigate around the late game in ways that force teams to stretch thin, right? In ways that, like, G2 tend to find ways to get advantage of, like, numbers advantages anywhere they need them to be to guarantee solid wins from it. This was, honestly, if we didn't get a game like this from G2, I would have been incredibly concerned about their approach to the best of 5 when they have to face T1. Let's take a look at the next game here, the last game of the Rumble stage. And what a last game it is. We've got the LCK's T1 versus the LPL's RNG, a rivalry almost as old as League of Legends. Just a couple years off. Just 5 years off. 5 years? 4 years. 3 years. The mathematics of years is a little weird when you're really counting back. Moving on. Honestly, for this game, like G2, T1 needed this win to show that they are back in form. And especially that they're not messing around. This looked much more like the macro-loving T1 we know and love, properly focusing on vision play, strong map movements, solid team fighting, all the works. That said, this was a little bit like the Twilight Zone of the MSI games, where T1 couldn't find a single lead in the early game, or nothing huge to speak of, while the Royals had control of the gold in the early game, and then mid-game comes around, and RNG are having a hard time finding macro plays that work for them, being tossed around by T1. This was super interesting. Now, if this is the expected finals between these two, like most people are going to expect this to be the finals, this would be super interesting as a best of 5 necessarily, as it shows at least that there should be some solid flexibility and incredible adaptability all around in terms of like the back and forth these two teams will have. But that's if because like mostly because like if we know that this is how those two teams are going to interact, great. Now, more so here, we know that the Royals is consistent and solid, and T1 had doubts thrown at them because of their 3 losses against the other semi-finalists that we've got. If they couldn't beat the Royals here, it would be a tough sell to see T1 as a potential favorites overall. If there's a game I'd recommend watching, honestly, it's this one. Let's take a look at the gold graph, honestly, here. Right? Because this game here, super interesting. The team fighting is excellent on both sides, really. Playing with their limits to the brink, and only once T1 finds an avenue where the Royals have no more tools could they really finish the game. And you can tell exactly that moment, right? There's this huge hump that goes off at the 19-minute mark, right, where they gotten full control. Because it's super weird to see this particular graph, seeing that T1 does not have the early lead. not until like 19, 20 minutes in, because the 12 to 13 minute weird little bump here is like, okay, RNG is just getting ready. They're about to get back. They slowly gain back their 1K lead, and then it's gone, right? T1 end up with Soul Point, not an issue. They end up with like all of the heralds, not an issue. The whole map control, fully for them. And this was a nice game to watch. Let's talk about the Talons before we move on to our general thoughts of the day here. Because this is such a disappointing team. And like, they've definitely came back in strides. As they come down to the last couple of days of the Rumble stage, I am stuck here thinking, but could it have been more? Could have the PCS had a representative like the Flying Oysters, who had shown huge, like solid play against the Talons in a way that most of the other teams weren't pulling off. They had exposed a specific weakness out of the Talons. And I'm here wondering, like, would have they been better? I don't know. It's really hard to tell in these kinds of situations because the Talons genuinely did improve over time. There was an aspect of it that really felt like they were slowly gelling together more and more. Where Unified and Kaiwing were finding their groove a little bit more. That Hanabi didn't have to be the squirrel carrier. That Bei and Juhan didn't have to feel consistently pressured to do more than what they were actually doing. And I want to emphasize something. Mostly because I keep hearing this from the casting desk, and I cannot for the life of me really understand why so much of the blame is going on Bei and Juhan. Both of them are the most consistent part of that team. The issue highly lies with the inconsistent play of Unified and Kaiwing. And I really hoped for a duo who have such a pedigree within their region that they would be a lot more proactive and a lot more thoughtful of their approach to the game than the large, passive, incoherent setups that we've seen from them. And granted, the last 2.5 days out of them showed incredible improvements across the board. Great. They found upsets against G2 in ways that were super satisfying. They found proper wins against the Buffalos, which most people were expecting to just be significantly better than them. And with just cause, there was a point where I was thinking that the detonation focus me should have been in their place. But over time, they've shown that they are a proper representative of the region. And with the improvement they had, that they were competitive across the board against the other 5 teams of this group. It's just so slow to get there, right? It's a whole lot of what ifs, right? What if the Buffalos got better? What if the Talons got better? Both of those teams were never going to know what they were at their peak, because part of the tournament format is how good are you at adapting, and the Talons just weren't that good at adapting. And that's just the unfortunate nature of the situation. I really hope that they'll still be one of the 2 teams going into Worlds in the summer, and that their playoff run there will reflect a much more coherent and cohesive team. But for the moment in time being, they've been a letdown for the most part, which is unfortunate. My general thoughts on the day, though. From everything that we've seen, it looks like it was leaning towards some sort of status quo, right? The only thing that comes from the whole situation is that, and I think Connor from our podcast mentioned that the Royals were definitely the most consistent team, and that benefited them more often than not. That the highs of G2 and T1 are not enough to bank on, especially if their lows show up more often than they should. That G2's win streak can definitely come crashing down, and that a lot of it still stems from the ability that Caps can come through, and that the Geniuses have just been on a nice solid trajectory, adapting properly across every games of their groups and the Rumble stage. And honestly, fantastic. Um, Now there's a situation a lot of people are talking about. Oh, we've got a 2015 or sorry 2015. The brain's going on the fritz. A 2019 MSI setup here where we've got the North Americans versus the Chinese representatives, and we've got T1 versus G2. Now the only thing about this that's really like 2019 is the T1 versus G2 in the semifinal situation. The other ones less so. The North American reps that went through had a rough time and were up against the world champs who had just literally knocked T1's socks off in a 12-minute game. So I don't think that quite applies as a great comparison. I do want to explore some of this, and I'll likely make a video for that later, probably either alone or with Josh and Connor. But for the moment in time being, the thoughts that I have here is that the Royals picked the right team, right? The only two teams that have beaten them in terms of like the Rumble stage and best one formats are literally T1 and G2. And if they have to pick between the Geniuses and G2, the Geniuses still haven't shown, they've shown upwards trajectory, but not quite the, like, where does their peak hit, right? Where do they plateau? And if they do plateau, is it less than where the Royals can go? Because Evil Geniuses are definitely improving at a rate that it would not surprise me if they get a game off, but I'm not expecting it. On the other hand, T1 versus G2, this is two radically different kinds of squads than from their 2019 counterparts. And T1 excels in best of formats. Now, if this went to 5 games, I also wouldn't be surprised. In fact, I'm pretty sure that's exactly what my predictions are. But G2 have gone a long way in best of 5s going like lossless. And part of their losing streak tells me that they're not adaptable as we've kind of implied them to be. They're mostly just very flexible in terms of the breadth of their pool, which means that if there's a strategy that they cannot adjust to and they try really hard, that's going to be very difficult for them to manage. I don't know. T1 on their part, I hope that they keep up their way that they play the best of 5 formats. A lot of the other times from their best of 5s, they kind of get a little overzealous, but they're also a lot good at bouncing back when need be. I guess my final little thought here is, going back to the champion pool picks, Ari and Lucian still stick at 100%. Wow, who's surprised? No one is. It really baffles me that people are still putting so much emphasis on Ari as a first pick blue side when it is not banned on the red side. Because there's clearly not enough a priority to always ban it on the red side, but enough for it to be picked first on the blue side. It has a lot of different setup mechanics, but I'm wondering if there's any other kind of picks. I kind of want to hear what you guys think in the comments down below. If there are any picks you think that could counter Ari in terms of something unexpected. I do think if it is going to come, G2 might likely take it. Just force T1 to just grab that thing and split. And the Lucian's never going to be let through. I don't ever see that a world in which that would happen. But the same 3 champions, the Wukongs, the Gwen, and the LeBlanc, still seem to have the same kind of emphasis. The thing that I'm wondering, though, is that Gwen gets let through way more than the other of those 4 in the top 5. And I'm wondering how much should there be an emphasis on getting rid of Gwen in the draft phase. Like, if we're not putting that one away as much as we should, why the bans on Wukong and LeBlanc so much more? Especially since it's doing so well. But those are foods for thoughts more than anything else, right? There's usually a playstyle indicator that would explain why there's such emphasis for some over the others. But I would love to hear your thoughts down below from everything. If this is the kind of stuff that you like, please leave a like and subscribe with all the stuff around. Again, just I want to get a conversation going. I really want to see what you guys predict are going to be the winners. I honestly still think T1 is going to win. Just by like the skin of their teeth. But like, they're going to be humbled by this when they head back to the LCK. What about you? Do you think that EG is going to pull it out? Do you think G2 is going to have a repeat? Or do you think the Royals are going to defend their title? I want to hear conversations. It's got to happen. I do appreciate everybody who do watch. It's been fantastic as a journey. We have only 3 more days left, the semifinals and the grand finals, and then the MSI times are done. But I'll be here. With that, I'll see you guys on Friday. Bye.